Okay, welcome back. This is the lecture on the cultural and political contexts to the importance of being earnest, part 2. See how many slides we get through this time. I'm going to start by talking about gender. I will also try and remember to tell you when I change the slide this time. I noticed I didn't do that last time. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're starting on the slide that says gender roles, separate spheres. And I think we've probably mentioned this before, but if not, just to remind you that in the 19th century, particularly in the Victorian period, an ideology of the separate spheres in which genders belonged developed, and it was used to justify women's lack of legal and democratic rights. It was meant to suggest that women and men were not superior to women, that's how it was argued, just that they had different ways they should live and different strengths and weaknesses. It just turned out that that meant that women should stay at home and men should go out into the world and do vital and important work. And some of the ways this was defended or even developed as an idea is that women were said to be more morally and physically suited to those domestic roles of being a mother and a wife. This argument, you might still hear today, is sometimes called biological determinism. So because women are the gender who get pregnant, the logic goes, therefore they are the ones who are the best at looking after children. I mean, don't just get pregnant, breastfeed and bring babies up. Also, women are smaller, weaker, sometimes this is described as softer, and you can see the logic of where this, or the bad logic of where this then leads people to. So that was the sort of biological argument, the physical argument, but there was also this moral idea that women were somehow morally superior to men. And you can see this is a particularly clever, insidious argument because it actually flatters women. And it's very, it says, it's not that we think you're terrible, we actually think you are this fine but kind of angelic gender, and therefore you should stay in the house where you can keep your beautiful, pure moral fibre. So that's the sort of the third bullet point I've explained there. This was partly to physical weakness, but also this idea of women's moral superiority. Their moral superiority could only be maintained if they were secluded from public life. And public life, it's not as bad as some places. Women were allowed out of the house, but they certainly weren't allowed public role, as in a parliamentary role, a professional career. They weren't supposed to be massively ambitious and speak out. And there's a particularly nauseating quote from John Ruskin, you might like. He was a very famous Victorian art critic, very well thought of moral thinker of the time. And this is his description of women. A woman must be enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Wise. But wise not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. So women have to renounce their self. Women's aim should be to make their husbands happy, their children happy, their families happy. That's and you might notice this is weird. I'm saying women, but it just sounds like mothers or wives. And that was the logic of this argument. You could only be a woman if you were a wife and a mother. And that led to the Victorians actually using the term, the woman problem. They called them excess women. Women who didn't have husbands, they really had no purpose in life or society and were, quite shamelessly positioned as burdens and people who should just keep quiet and keep out of the way. Okay, I'm going to change the slide now. Okay, so on the next slide, whose title is First Wave Feminism. Those of you doing sociology will probably have heard this term. And first wave feminism is the agitation for legal and political rights. So agitation for access to higher education and the right to vote began in the 1860s. And interestingly, we mentioned this when we talk about political reform, that people, even women themselves, many women who wanted to have the vote, accepted or argued that they should also have access to education, as good as men's education, before they should vote. We are talking a lot about upper middle class women when we're talking about this development. Working class women still carried on working, working class women carried on leaving the home, working class women did not have the privilege or the wealth to support this kind of ideal of femininity. But the ideology was incredibly strong. So women wanted the right to go particularly into the professions, which you could only do if you'd been to university. So the logical step was they had to go to university if they wanted to become doctors, lawyers, those sorts of professions. There was a very famous woman, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who sat the only medical exams she could that weren't forbidden to women. They were to be like a pharmacist or a apothecary, and there was no law against sitting them. So she, clever woman, went and sat those exams, which meant she could practice medicine to a certain degree. The year after she did that, they banned women from sitting those exams as well. But that was in 1865. And there was an MP called John Stuart Mill, who was a big supporter of women having the right to vote and this sort of first wave feminism. In the Second Reform Bill in 1867, he tried to add an amendment to give women the vote, or some women the vote. And he also published a very famous work that was called On the Subjection of Women, about how women were subjected, particularly middle-class women, were subjected by the sort of ideology of gender in the 19th century. By 1878, the new university, the University of London, still very few universities in the country, Oxford and Cambridge, a couple in Scotland. The University of London was a new university, quite modern, quite forward-thinking, and that was the first university to award women degrees. And it was the campaign for women's suffrage, that as a right to vote, started late in the 19th century. And at this point, it was not what you might think of. It wasn't the dramatic, exciting, throwing yourself under horses sort of campaign. It was petitions and public meetings. It was all very legal in the 19th century. But you can see on the slide there a particularly nasty anti-women cartoon from the satirical magazine Punch. She's a very typical stereotype of what was called a blue stocking. You can see she's drawn as unattractive, wrinkles. She's wearing glasses. You know what that means about a woman reading too much. She's almost got sort of trousers on. So it's kind of mocking her for not being a woman because she's in the House of Commons. That's the joke. But also she kind of is a woman because she's brought her knitting with her. So you can see that. A troubled dream of the future, it calls it. Okay, I'm going to stop there.